The first time I went to the West Bank, I was lucky enough to go with a friend of mine who happened to be Palestinian American. And we stayed in Ramallah, where her family was, and because I was with her, I got to meet her friends and go and see parts of the community I probably wouldn't have seen otherwise, and I met preservationists and labor rights activists and people who had just been released from jail and artists and all this very rich depth and breadth of the community there. And as I left on my own, I was at the Calandia checkpoint. And this is a place where you, of course, are reminded when you are a visitor of how different your life would be if you lived in the occupied territories and in Palestine, where you have to go and wait in line. Those of us who are international, of course, get the privilege of going through the fast line. I had my suitcase, and a young soldier with a gun looked at the suitcase and said, "Why do you have this?" And I said, "Oh, I've just been here for the week, and now I'm going to go to Jerusalem and go to the airport and go home." And he said, Ramallah is garbage. Why are you in Ramallah? You should be in Jerusalem." And it was an amazing experience for me, because what I realized was that he literally, physically could not see the people in front of him. This world, this whole universe that was literally feet away, that would open up everything for him. To him, he had been raised to have the eyes of the colonizer, as most of us have also been raised with those eyes. And that is in many ways to be blind to what is in front of you. And it really had an impact on me, because, of course, those of us raised with the Western European values of the things that matter to us are things we can measure and see and touch. That's all that matters. And seeing, of course, is believing. But we know from neuroscience, we know from our experience that, in fact, this process of colonization is so deep and so profound that it literally changes how we see the world, and that's where its insidious power is. When I'm speaking to general audience, often most of the questions are about how to guarantee the safety of the Jews, which is an important question, but it's asked as though Palestinians have no need for safety, that's only a Jewish question, or the legitimacy questions about armed resistance for Palestinians as though extraordinary, incalculable violence had not been wrought upon Palestinians by the Israeli government. We have so internalized this narrative and this way of thinking, and it's not accidental, it's certainly by design. So let me start with this. One of the questions we often ask ourselves is why Americans, people on this continent and in the West, so easily accept the dominant Israeli narrative. And I think the answer to me is obvious. We have literally been primed for generations by our own national narrative, our own narrative of manifest destiny, white supremacy, exceptionalism. Many of us are well versed with this language about the special relationship between Israel and the United States, and it's very real. In fact, no country in the history of the world collected over time has received more largesse, more military and financial aid from another country than Israel. It is, in fact, a special relationship. Israel gets a free pass in a way that nobody else does, and gets virtually unlimited, unconditional diplomatic support from the United States, as well as extraordinary financial support. Understanding the root of this relationship is not just idle curiosity. It's actually really important for those of us whose political analysis says that all of Israel's human rights violations, as they continue, the entrenchment of the occupation and so on and so forth, the horrific attack on Gaza, these things are made possible by the United States specifically. It is our unconditional support that makes it possible. So understanding that relationship and changing it is our work. Fundamentally, I think it is about these common national narratives which shape how we see and understand ourselves and our actions, how we justify killing, extraction, land theft, and so on in moral terms. So we have mythical national narratives of two settler colonial peoples Israel and here, who both believe that we have a divine mandate to settle a so-called empty, or I say in quotes, savage land, and make it a kind of heaven on earth. Ethnic cleansing, even genocide, all of these things have been divinely justified. Israel's to be a light unto nations, and what would become the United States, a kind of heaven on earth. And I want to read you a quote, Donald Peace, who is a literary critic, talking about virgin land and the language that we use in the settling of this land. Virgin land depopulated the landscape in the imaginary register so that it might be perceived as unoccupied territory in actuality. The metaphor turned the landscape into a blank page, understood to be the ideal surface onto which to inscribe the history of the nation's manifest destiny. Virgin land narratives place the movement of the national people across the continent in opposition to the savagery attributed to the wilderness as well as the native peoples, who figured as indistinguishable from the wilderness. And later it fostered an understanding of the campaign of Indian removal as nature's beneficent choice of the Anglo-American settlers over the native inhabitants for its cultivation. Does that sound familiar at all? The Zionist version, I'll just say the famous Zionist slogan is a land with no people for a people with no land. And Israel's miraculous military victories have always been seen as signs of God's hand. And of course, in both cases, this system of this notion of a heaven on earth or a light unto nations, I mean, when you really look at it, it's predicated on a system of racial and ethnic superiority. Who gets to be human and who gets to be civilized, and who is cast as subhuman, who exists and who is invisible or who must be disappeared. Who can claim the land because we have a divine right to it, and who has no rights to it. And the fundamental root of all that we like to call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in fact is this sort of ongoing process of ethnic cleansing, is the fact that it was a land with people. It was a land with people, and specifically the wrong people, who by definition could not be part of an ethnic exclusivist state. So the original violence of the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of the land of Palestinians, continues on a daily basis to this day, just as we heard of this struggle continues today. The process of colonization never stopped, although today we call them facts on the ground, and Palestinians are talked about as a demographic threat. And land annexation is justified, as always, as security. Now, what makes this issue complex for some and deeply challenging for many is that early European Zionists, who first started coming to Palestine in the late 1800s, had themselves suffered from a profoundly long history of fierce Christian European anti-Jewish oppression, forced conversions, ghettos, pogroms, repression, discrimination, et cetera, and then with the culmination, of course, as we know, in the genocide known as the Holocaust or the Shoah. Now, all genocides and acts of violence have their unique features, and they must be studied and understood, but I think it's really important to situate the genocide of Jews in a broader context, and not as an exceptional, metaphysically unique event that has nothing to say about other systems of oppression. Some 6 million Jews died, but we also know 5 million others were targeted for annihilation. The Roma people, gays, Poles and Ukrainians were mass killed, and so on. So just to state the obvious, the Holocaust did not mark the sudden and inexplicable birth of the white European capacity to commit genocide. No one knows this better than the indigenous people of this continent, the descendants of enslaved Africans, the people of the Congo, so on and so forth. So while it is important to situate what is happening in Israel-Palestine today and the work we have to do in the U.S. for justice as part of a lengthy historical cascade of impacts rooted in European colonialism, racism, white supremacy, U.S. empire, anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish oppression, corporate greed, all of it. We have to look at all of that and not take things out of context, which sometimes we do, as though what is happening in Israel and Palestine is somehow exceptional, not connected to these things. The extreme version of that attitude, which we do sometimes see in what we call this liberation movement, is either, or just in this country, is either the people who think Jews and Muslims have been fighting since the dawn of time. It's just this thing that they have and they hate each other, and that's really what the problem is, which is absolutely not true. That's when you take this out of the context of European colonialism. Or the other side, which is that, U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. government is essentially beneficent and just and fair, and the only reason they're acting poorly in the case of Palestine is the devious and particularly powerful and manipulative Jewish lobby. And that's the other perspective. And both of these perspectives, to me, besides feeding into a form of bigotry, are pretty much a circular firing range where we fire at each other, and the actual forces that are benefiting from this divide and conquer strategy do not have to be held to account. What is absolutely clear also, though, is that early Zionist leaders were simultaneously both victims of and willing agents of white supremacist colonialism. In fact, they made their case explicitly to British colonizers who they knew did not want Jews, but did want to maintain colonial designs in the Mideast. And this is, Herzl wrote, "We can be the vanguard of culture against barbarianism." And another early Zionist leader said, "We will endeavor to do in the Near East what the English did in India. It is our intention to come to Palestine as the representatives of culture and to take the moral borders of Europe to the Euphrates River." In fact, the early Zionists internalized the same white supremacist hierarchy which had been used against them. And when you read accounts of the new Jew and this idea of a new Jew that would be born when Israel was born, they tended to be blonde and blue-eyed and way taller than me and very healthy, and they were counterposed to the sort of embarrassing, shameful shtetl Jew who was dark and short and hunched over and religious and an embarrassment. And I want to say there's a lot of sensitivity talking about this issue as though you can only be a victim or you can only be an oppressor. It is the experience of colonized and oppressed people to internalize the ideology of their colonizer or their oppressor. And in this case, these early Zionists were no different. And it is in many cases this kind of a form of anti-Jewish hatred that was in these particularly certain elements of early Zionism is very active today in all sorts of extraordinary ways. Jewish aspirations for freedom and our very real trauma have unwittingly been made a tool of empire and have literally and deliberately been re-triggered and re-traumatized over and over again. So, for example, the struggle against anti-Jewish hatred has been co-opted into a primary tool of demonizing the Arab and Muslim world in order to justify U.S. wars and intervention for profit, and of course to justify Israeli expansionism. And a perfect example of that is a traumatic event happens in Denmark or in France, and you have the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, actually literally going to those places and going to Denmark and inviting mass migration of the Jews to Israel from their homes, and in France as well. In France, he did this in a synagogue. Again, people are traumatized, people are scared, and instead of being present with that and joining a broader coalition against anti-Muslim hatred and all forms of racism, he actually took that moment to say, see, you all should encourage more settlements in Israel, and I can guarantee you that not only insulting the people who live in those countries and love their countries and love their communities. But if they were to actually immigrate to Israel, they would be put in settlements and they would be used in the settlement project. They would absolutely be manipulated. And so there are numerous examples of this and way that this manipulation happens. I've talked a little bit about the colonization of my own community of Jews and how we have to undo the ways that we have been raised, undo these forms of thinking, and how we've done that. And resisting this narrative that we have been primed with around a kind of supremacy and invisibilizing. Jewish Voice for Peace started some years ago in a small room with 3 young women, and it just was 3 young women who were undergraduates, at this case UC Berkeley, 3 young Jewish women. And it started with who they knew, and then who they knew, and who they know. And 10 or 15 years ago, to be Jewish and stand in a Jewish communal space and dare to speak about the equality of Palestinians and the legitimacy of their call for justice was to be called crazy, was to be called insane. I like to think of those folks as early adopters. They were the ones that first had these ideas in those communities, and there are many, probably people in this room on whose shoulders we stand, who many, many, many years ago were the ones in their communities, and we are deeply grateful to those people, and we know how hard it was. But we also know from sociology and how you shift from a minority position to a majority position is that somebody has to be the first person in the room, and if you are the only person in the room, you will be seen as idiosyncratic and strange. But if a second person gets up and speaks that same narrative and story and does it consistently, then people start to listen. And if they start to hear that minority opinion, even if it's just 3 of you, over and over again, consistently stated, you can change that minority opinion to a majority opinion. Because it turns out that most of what we think of as a deeply entrenched viewpoint is actually just conformity. It's actually just people going with the flow, doing what other folks do. And so what we've seen is an extraordinary quickening and rapid changing of the Jewish community, Jewish Voice for Peace, particularly after the horror of this summer in Gaza. We are growing so fast, we barely know what to do, and we have 60 or 70 chapters. We have hundreds of academics and artists and rabbis joining us and young students joining us, and that transition is absolutely happening. And the tipping point is real. And the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, I want to say before Omar speaks, has been a really critical part of this change. I actually believe that one of the most effective things that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement does, and these divestment initiatives do, is to challenge that narrative, is to help us decolonize our minds. If you have, any of you have been, and I don't know if that's happened here, in these, at UC Berkeley and other universities where I've seen 6-7 hour hearings where Palestinian students and Lebanese students and others are able to finally tell their story, to change the culture of invisibility, to change the culture of monologue that only tells one story. That is to see and experience of an entire room full of people decolonizing their minds and whose lives are permanently changed. This is the work we do in the Jewish community. This is the work we do in every community. And I just leave you with this new slogan. I started with a slogan, which is the classic Zionist slogan, a land with no people for people with no land. But as we rewrite our own culture and our own history and our own future, the new slogan that I leave you with is, all people are chosen and all land is holy. Thank you.